last episode, we found ourselves in the middle of World War I, in Flanders, in the thick of trench warfare. In this episode, we'll find out how World War I treated our grandfather, Walter William Plampin. But first we start back at Walter's birth in 1897 in Patterswick, a little village in Essex. Baby Walter was the fifth child born, having three elder sisters that I heard spoken about when I was a teenager: Alice, Clara, and Jessie. Walter also had a big brother, just a year older than him, baptized as James, but known as Frederick, who subsequently died in the war in Flanders. Baby Walter was baptized in the local village church, St. Mary the Virgin. 3 years later, in 1900, we find the family has moved 8 miles away to Scotty's farm, Easthorpe, where Walter's dad has moved up a little in the world and is now employed as a horseman. We can imagine young Walter, now 3 years old, playing around the farm with 4-year-old brother Frederick and the new addition to the family, 1-year-old Charles Arthur. Unfortunately for the boys, the fun would come to an end, as under the Education Act, these boys would be required to attend compulsory schooling once they reached 5. 10 years later, the family experienced a tragedy. Father Charles died, leaving our great-grandmother Eliza, widowed at 48 years old, with 6 children. The following year, in 1911, the 2 eldest sisters, Alice and Clara, were out of the house, no doubt working to supplement the family's income. Frederick, at 14, and our Walter, 13, are both working as agricultural labourers at Scotty's farm, which would secure the family's accommodation. Youngest son Charles is still at school, being 10 years old, as is the newest and last addition to the family, Emily, who I remember being spoken about as Aunt Em. Em is 7 years old at this stage. At some point during the next 3 years, young Walter learnt or taught himself the skills of motorcar driving. Today this sounds unremarkable, but it was astonishing before 1920. Horsepower still dominated farms, but had reached their peak. Very slowly the first motor cars were brought by affluent owners of country homes. These early motor cars were temperamental and required constant maintenance. Of course, the owners looked to their staff for someone who could take on the onerous job of driving them about and being a mechanic. Historians tell us the boys most likely to be picked for this job would have shown curious minds, the ability to learn by tinkering, and a background in horses where their experience with machinery, harness, and rural road conditions made them ideal candidates for the role. This introduction of a new technology proved to be momentous for our Walter, as will unfold in this episode. I think of the moments in time that present opportunities and crossroads for individuals. For Walter, his started 11 years earlier when his father Charles stepped into the role of horseman on Scotty's farm. This opened a path in which the farm owners could view our Walter as a good choice for a role for which there was no precedent, a role where there was no handbook or mentors, where you taught yourself on the job and quickly became indispensable to the farm owners. 3 years later, on the 28th of July 1914, World War I broke out when our Walter was 17. Over the next year and a half, a massive number of Englishmen who were 19 years or older volunteered to fight. They were driven by patriotism, peer pressure, and the belief that the war would be short. This created a huge volunteer army, but caused a severe immediate labour crisis in the countryside. Walter's elder brother Frederick was caught up in the fervour, and as soon as he turned 19, volunteered for the army, signing up just before Christmas 1915. By 1916, the army had already lost many men on the Western Front and urgently required more men in the pipeline. Young men, like our Walter, were conscripted to army reserves to be trained in readiness to be sent overseas as soon as they turned 19. You can see that Walter signed up on the 31st of January 1916, the first month that service became compulsory. After signing up, Walter underwent the customary army medical. You can see he wasn't a physical Adonis. He stood 5'3.5 inches, which is 160 centimeters, and weighed 139 pounds or 63 kilograms. His 34.5-inch chest could expand only 2.5 inches when he inflated his lungs as much as he could. His physical development was recorded by the Army on the 31st of January 1916 as fair. Just as well, then, that Walter had a skill that was in high demand by the Army. His skill as a motor driver fast-tracked him into the Army Services Corps and away from direct fighting. The Army Services Corps were responsible for delivering food, ammunition, fuel, water, and equipment to the front lines using horses but increasingly motor transport. They ensured troops had everything they needed to fight. They were the unsung heroes of World War I, playing a crucial, though often overlooked role in sustaining the fighting men. Their logistical feats were prodigious, and they worked under very dangerous conditions. But before Walter could fulfill this role, he had to wait out his time training in the reserves before he could be legally sent overseas at 19. The good thing about the Army is they keep meticulous records, so we can track Walter's experiences. We first find Walter stationed at the Mechanical Transport Depot at 5 Bulmer Place, Notting Hill. Here you can see the scribbled note of an officer. This man will turn 19 on November 1918. That was 2 years away. You can almost feel the officer willing these young boys to turn 19 so they can be legally sent to the front. 4 days later, Walter was posted to Grove Park, southeast London. Grove Park had been a workhouse since 1902, but was taken over by the Army and transformed into a depot with barracks. Up to 4,000 men passed through Grove Park each week for training, medicals, and provisioning. We can get a good idea of what Grove Park looked like from photographs from the time. 2 days later, we see that Walter formally passed his driver's license. Clearly, the Army were focused on dotting the I's and crossing the T's and getting Walter ready for service. 1 month later, Walter received official notice that he would be posted overseas at the end of his training period. How could this be? Walter was only 17. As always, the Army had a neat sidestep to the age issue. They simply said that the Army Services Corps was not a fighting unit, so the 19-year-old age limit did not apply. Walter still had almost a year of training to get through. You can imagine this 17-year-old lad, independent in a sense for the first time, and probably feeling quite important that he had a skill that was rare at the time and in strong demand by the nation. This could have gone a bit to our Walter's head. We have a record that Walter left the barracks without permission on Christmas Eve 2016 and only returned late on Boxing Day. He missed the regulation tattoo and was marked absence for 36 hours or so. He soon found out that this was not tolerated by the Army. He had to forfeit 3 days of pay and 7 days of punishment, most likely being confined to a cold cell with minimal food and possibly with grueling fatigue duty like digging or road building. I wonder whether he snuck home for Christmas, or perhaps there was a girl involved. Had Walter started to hear stories from the war front? Was knowing he was close to being posted overseas make him take what could be a last chance at living? As Walter's training came to a close and posting became imminent, Walter learnt that he'd been assigned to the 59th Division, who had just arrived at Grove Park. The 59th Division had been formed before the war as a part-time volunteer unit only for home defence. They had been posted in Ireland to quell the nationalist uprisings in Dublin and the Curragh. As World War I progressed, the division was hastily recalled to England for rush deployment to the Western Front. Army reports note that the division could not be considered properly trained, as it was never a professional unit, and now there was little time to make good on that. Some cursory training and re-equipping occurred in the few months the 59th Division was at Grove Park. This inexperienced, ill-equipped division was then sent directly to the front, with Walter in attendance in his role as a motor driver in the Army Services Corps. Walter would be driving a truck like this. The division was thrown into the height of fighting in France, south of the Somme, near Estrie. The division suffered high casualties due to their combat inexperience, but miraculously they did manage to hold the line as the Germans withdrew from the Somme region. As the Germans retreated, the 59th Division and Walter's mission turned to pushing and pursuing the enemy back to the Hindenburg Line, a formidable deep German defensive fortification of concrete pillboxes, machine guns, and complex trench systems. The inexperience of the 59th Division was really felt in this difficult mission. They met a bloody repulse at the highly contested village of Le Vergier. Two divisions of the 59th Division were virtually destroyed in the fighting, with nearly all front-line officers in the 176th Brigade failing to return. They were relieved by the cavalry and had a few days' rest before being sent to the Cambrai front line at Havrincourt and Flesquières. They experienced brutal, high-casualty fighting here, but still, again, managed to hold the Germans back. By the end of June 1917, the division, including Walter, were relieved and moved for rest at Barastre, a small village in northern France occupied by British troops. Here they were given a month's break to prepare for the horrors of Flanders in Belgium and northern France. Ironically, during this rest period, and most likely unknown to Walter, his brother Frederick was killed in Flanders. You may remember the Menin Gate in Ypres, Belgium, from episode 10. It is where a bugle sounds the last post to honour all the men whose bodies were never recovered from the Battle of Passchendaele, including Frederick, our great-uncle. After their recuperation in Barastra, Walter and the 59th Division were sent directly to the Battle of the Menin Road Ridge to join other British, Australian and South African forces. The battle over 3 days was costly, but successful for the Allies, capturing German-held high ground on the Gulleveld Plateau in Belgium. The very next day, Walter supported the 59th Division in the Battle of Polygon Wood. The division successfully repelled the Germans and then, over 4 days, defended itself against enemy attack, which included some very heavy artillery and night bombing by enemy aircraft. The division had 2,000 casualties. You can tell by this that the 59th Division, despite its original inexperience, was involved in some of the most notable battles of World War I. This continued for the rest of the war. One can only imagine the effect on Walter of this relentless horror. I wonder if being at slight arm's length from the front line gave him a fuller picture of the slaughter unfolding. I believe the only thing that kept Walter alive was the fact his skills as a driver kept him out of the direct fighting. If, like his brother Frederick, he'd been used as a fighter, I doubt he would have survived the war, meaning you and I would not be here. The end of the war was announced on the 11th of September 1918, Armistice Day. This did not mean the troops got to go home. The Allied troops were swarmed into Germany to lock down and hold the peace. Only once this was achieved could the laborious work of repatriating 5 million service people back to England begin. 6 weeks after Armistice Day, we know Walter was shipped back to England via Alexandria on the HM Teutonic. His papers show he was being given a month's furlough, a temporary leave of absence from active military duty, which allowed a soldier to return home for a set period. At the end of this rest period, he was sent to Abington Park Camp in Winchester, from where he was demobbed. Walter's war was over. You wonder how a person picks up an ordinary life again after experiencing the horror of a war like World War One. Well, 1 month later, Walter married. He chose our grandmother, Rebecca Terry Bailey, as his wife, a 26-year-old from Deal in Kent. The couple were married in Eastry, Kent, under a civil registration marriage. This was quite common immediately after the war, when people wanted to quickly put the war behind them and not have the long planning and expense associated with church weddings. Walter and Rebecca turn up 1 year later in the 1921 census. They were living at 16 Spencer Road, Finsbury. Walter had brought his skills as a motor driver back to Civvy Street and found employment as a commercial driver with John Burker and Co. Limited on the High Street of Kensington. Once again, Walter was in the right place at the right time with the right skill, as London experienced a post-war period of intense reconstruction and modernization, introducing motor buses, taxis, and delivery trucks in place of horse-drawn vehicles. Walter and his wife Rebecca were also now the proud parents of 7-week-old baby Douglas Walter Plampin, our father. Also living in the house was great Aunt Clara, 30 years old, single, and working as a domestic help to Robert Prinkle and Sons at 52 Clerkenwell Road, London, manufacturing jewellers and goldsmiths who would become one of the most successful jewellery concerns in England. We should have census records for a decade later in 1931. This census was taken, but all records for England and Wales were destroyed in a fire at a storage 11 years later. The next census date was scheduled for 1941. This time, census taking had to be abandoned as the Second World War had started the year before on the 1st of September 1939. Fortunately for ancestry seekers, authorities had chosen instead to do a substitute census called a register later that month, which is where we find Walter and his family again. This register was an administrative necessity, as the authorities needed to issue identity cards and ration books for the war effort. As Andrew Marr, a prominent British journalist, author, and television broadcaster, writes, this register is considered one of the most important documents in recent British history. It forms a comprehensive record of the civil population on the outbreak of war. It captures a people whose lives were about to change forever. It records the streets that within months, under the assault of the Luftwaffe, were to disappear. Families would be separated by the events of war, evacuation, conscription, and sometimes worse. We can only imagine Walter's thoughts at the prospect of another war. All the work he had done to establish a normal life after the First War was now under threat. And now he had a wife and 2 children, our father and firstborn Douglas, and younger daughter Daphne. At the outbreak of World War II in 1939, we find the family living at 23 Oval Road, Camden Town. This house was known in our family as the Big House. We see Walter still working as a commercial driver, but now also enlisted as a part-time air raid precautions warden, known as the ARP. He was one of over 1.5 million volunteers operating as a crucial civil defense force to protect civilians. The ARP enforced strict nighttime blackouts, distributed gas masks, guided people to shelters, and managed the immediate aftermath of bombings, such as reporting incidents, assisting casualties, and dealing with unexploded bombs. Walter's wife and our grandmother, Rebecca, is listed as an unpaid domestic, in other words, a housewife. Our father, Douglas, is just 18 years old and listed as working as a pathological and bacteriological laboratory assistant. Here we see Dad just starting out in his career. His sister, Daphne, about 7 years younger than him, is not in the house. Within 3 days of World War II being declared, almost 1 million London children were evacuated to the relative safety of the countryside, where they were placed with foster families. We know Daff was evacuated to Newton Abbot in Devon, coincidentally the same town attached to the Seal Hain Agricultural College where I later worked. I remember Daff saying when she visited us in Devon that she had very bad memories of that time in Newton Abbot. Also in the house at 23 Oval Road is Great Aunt Clara, now 48, and her husband, 49-year-old Stephen Ball, a waiter. We can also find Lily Pierce, a 30-year-old cashier. I thought at first this was our grandmother's sister, also called Lily, under a married name, but this Lily is single. So perhaps she was a lodger, bringing in some additional income. We will tell the story of how World War II impacted our family in the next episode. Suffice to say, it was an awful time. By the end of the war in 1945, Walter and Rebecca were still living at 23 Oval Road. By some miracle, the house had avoided being bombed to smithereens. Records show that Camden Town was heavily affected by high explosive bombs during the World War II Blitz, with hundreds of homes destroyed and thousands of residents killed. Walter must have felt he was back at the front again, with bombing right at his doorstep. By the next year, in 1946, Walter and Rebecca, and sister Clara and her husband Stephen, had moved into 95 Lee Road, Perryvale, in Ealing Northwest, not a million miles from Wembley, and 21 minutes' drive from where I studied all things equestrian at Harrowweald. I had no idea I was this close to my grandparents' former home, and no one in my family thought to mention it. I've dug out a real estate blurb on the home, which highlights the home's size. The family moving out of London to Perryvale after World War II was part of a big and necessary period of post-war rebuilding. 1 in 6 people in London had lost their homes from bombing. New suburbs needed to be rapidly built. Perryvale, for example, was a tiny rural parish of under 100 people before it was quickly developed into a bustling part of Greater London, boasting a village feel and brand new housing. I find it curious that Walter and his sister and their spouses persisted with co-living. I could understand it immediately after World War I, when usual life was upset and Clara was single, but this is 25 years later. I did a bit of digging back into Great Aunt Clara's history. At 20 years old, she shows up on a register at the House of Mercy in Great Maplestead, Essex. You'll see she is listed as an inmate. The House of Mercy was an Anglican institution for unmarried pregnant women. Their goal was the moral reformation of these so-called fallen women. Their babies were taken from them at birth and placed in orphanages, never to be seen by their mothers again. The mothers then entered 2 years of strict religious instruction, literacy classes, and training for future employment in respectable domestic service. Clara was trained as a cook. You might remember that 10 years later, Clara was working as a domestic for the up-and-coming manufacturing jewelers, Robert Pringle and Sons. Was Clara's history why Walter kept his sister close? Was there a vulnerability in Clara that needed brotherly care in the absence of their father and eldest brother? At Walter's retirement at 65, he and Rebecca moved a bit further out of London to Farnborough. For the first time in their married life, they lived without Clara in the home. She and her husband had moved to Rochford, Essex. Our grandparents' move to Farnborough mirrored a second wave of people choosing to move even further out from broader London as the rail network expanded to service commuter towns. It captured the search for modern and affordable housing in greenfield sites, particularly where there was strong local employment. In Farnborough's case, it was closely tied to the Royal Aircraft Establishment, or the RAE, which provided stable, high skilled employment, which attracted professionals and their families. But for our Walter, employment was not his concern anymore. He was just retired and could look forward to some golden years, free of the horrors of war and the grind of employment. But it was not to be. Within a year, Walter contracted lung cancer, dying on the 15th of June, 1963. His sister Clara had died just 2 months before. Walter's probate confirms he left £2,057, 6 shillings and 11 pence in the bank, about £60,000 in today's currency. My sister Kath says she remembers Walter as a kind, quiet man. That is exactly how I've imagined Walter. There is something about his story that talks of an unassuming man who has quietly accepted opportunities that have placed him at the forefront of big changes in society, the introduction of mechanized cars. And just as quietly, he has managed to use these skills to navigate through two deadly wars, not by shirking duty, but by using his skills that allowed him to stay out of the trenches, which would surely have killed him. The words quiet hero come to mind. Walter, I salute you.